First of all, you mentioned earlier that you are setting your hopes on Europe, and I would say maybe you might want to prepare yourself for some disappointments, but this is only a personal remark. I have a follow-up question from the earlier speaker. You mentioned that we should be more objective when it comes to China, and and see also their achievements. But my question would be, if the Chinese population sees those achievements and appreciates them, why do they still need censorship then? They shouldn't need it if all the whole of the population sees those achievements. That's a contradiction to me. And second of all, could you elaborate on Taiwan? Why do you think China would accept the status quo? Why do you think China would say, well, this is fine, we can live with it as long as everybody plays along? Or don't you think that China at some point will just say, we want Taiwan back and we want it our way and we just don't accept it like it is at the moment? Thanks.
Okay. The thing about your question on censorship is that it tries to sort of say, more or less, excuse me, that in the West we have no censorship, that's white. China, which has censorship, is black, okay? And I would say that in most societies are shades of gray. You have no formal censorship in Western societies. Believe me, you have informal censorship, right? And in the United States today, by the way, it goes down to political correctness. And even in the greatest universities, right, in the US today, and I'm told by graduates of these great universities, I just was there, that the political culture is pushing towards political correctness, and there's no formal censorship, but there's so many things you just cannot say anymore. And if you want an example of this, read the Financial Times this weekend, lunch with FTs with a Yale professor, Amy Chua. She spoke freely. See what happened to her. That's also censorship, okay? So there are different kinds of censorship. There are the blatant kind of censorship you can see, and the not so blatant kind. So the only point I want to tell you about Chinese society is this, which is, I think this is the one reality that almost nobody can understand, which is that most of the Chinese people have never been happier. It's amazing. You have to live there to see it. And in my book, I cite one of America's greatest strategic thinkers, George Kennan. And he says at the end of the day, the outcome of the contest between the United States and Soviet Union, the old Cold War, would depend on which society enjoys greater spiritual vitality. Where are the people happier, especially the bottom 50%? And today, this is a reality that you just find it difficult to accept, but it is real. The bottom 50% in America are about to vote Trump back in 2024. Trump is coming back, right? The danger of Trump coming back is so real, and I can tell you that shows you what a difficult, divided, dysfunctional society the United States has become, that they can vote Trump back. That's unhappiness surfacing. In China, by contrast, the people till today are still amazed at how much their lives have improved and are happy with the situation that they have down there. Which is why, to be honest, with apologies to you, I reacted very strongly to the word repression, because the Chinese people actually understand and appreciate how much they have advanced. And the Chinese actually now, the people actually, and this is something that I met someone who was here a few days ago who speaks Chinese fluently, has been there recently, And he said, in China, there used to be a natural awe and respect for the West, which was good. But that awe and respect for the West is diminishing as they see what is happening in Western societies, especially the United States, and they see what's happening in China. So I want you all to understand that don't use black and white categories to understand China and the West. Understand the strengths of the West, the weaknesses of the West, understand the strengths of China, weaknesses of China, and then make a comparison. Don't do black and white comparisons. And on Taiwan, basically, just my simple answer is, if you don't shake the status quo, we can keep peace. No, but the Chinese are not going to go out and launch a military war. Because again, I discussed this in my book, the Chinese believe that the best way to win a war is without fighting. If you have to fight, it means you're not a good general.
With time for 3 more questions, I think the next
Gerard
one.
had a question.
Yeah, Gerard.
Thank you. I'd like to ask this question to both Kishore as well as...
No, ask Stefan, please.
Yeah, Stefan as well, because I'd like to hear both your views on this point. Actually, it's a point that the lady earlier just mentioned just now. This issue of Taiwan and whether or not either side would shift the consensus or shift the status quo. I think you, Kishore, you feel that the risk is that the West would be the one, or America would be the one that would move the status quo. But how are you so sure that China won't do the same thing? Because as far as I understand, from my little understanding of China, that there is unfinished business for many generations since 1949, that Taiwan has not been reunited with the mainland. And how are you so sure that China is not going to, in its effort to project its progress and project the great revival of the Chinese nation, from what they call it, that they would seek to retake the mainland, whether by force or other means, and that could trigger the war. And I'm asking this as a Singaporean politician because I'm concerned about the peace and security of our region. So I'd like to hear both your views on that.
Yeah. Stefan.
Well, actually, during the time before the fall of the wall, every German politician on certain days when they were holding speeches said, in the end, like Cato Senex said, Carthaginam esse delendam, they said Germany has to be reunited. And in a certain way, the politicians in China said the same about Taiwan going back into mainland China. The difference now with Xi Jinping is that he said that this has to happen during his time of life or his time being the head of the government. So in a certain way, it's good that he stopped the limit for being the president and the chief of the party. So we have a little bit more time. And he is not so under pressure to do it within the next 4 or 5 years. But I think the risk is pretty big. And the risk that the whole thing is getting out of control is pretty big too. And the position of the Americans to say we are defending the security and independence of Taiwan, not saying it in clear words, but to give the feeling that they wouldn't tolerate if China takes over Taiwan, is the only way to stop China really to take it over. So I think what you said is really correct. Don't touch it. But the danger of a country that's feeling more and more strong to take it over at least when we see what's happening in Hong Kong, is pretty big.
Well, I mean, it is possible, certainly. I mean, it's possible you may wake up tomorrow morning and we hear that President Xi announces that he's going to invade Taiwan. It's possible, certainly. But if my assessment of how they behave is correct, they do very careful, comprehensive calculations. And one of the biggest questions they ask is, on whose side is time on, right? And the Chinese are shrewd enough students of geopolitics to know that the world will treat China this way when it is number 2. By 2030, China becomes number 1. The world will treat China very differently. There's a huge amount of deference that number 1 gets that number 2 doesn't get. Okay? So, if that's coming your way, right? And if you watch this, the fruit, it's going to ripen and fall. Why take it now? What's the rush? But if you sense that someone is trying to change the facts on the ground and recognize Taiwanese independence, right? Then they will act. So that's how I think. But they are very careful, rational actors. Which is why actually what the Trump administration was trying to do, especially in the last years. Incidentally, there is, I listen to lots of podcasts, okay? I think there was a podcast on Seneca which described that in the last 9 months of the Trump administration, the world went through a very dangerous phase, because until then, even though Trump took actions against China, he was still quite restrained. Trump, actually, to be fair to him, didn't like geopolitical quarrels and so on and so forth. He didn't want to be bothered with those. But after COVID-19 broke out, when Trump realized that COVID-19 was killing his chances for re-election, he became very angry towards China, and he began to talk about China virus and so on and so forth. So all the restraint that Trump personally was applying on the anti-China hawks disappeared in the last 9 months of the Trump administration. And therefore Pompeo, Pence and Pottinger literally ran riot, And that's how the speech that Pompeo gave in the Nixon Library was incredibly inflammatory, against China, because no one stopped him. Now, when things like that begin to happen, then you get dangers. So the good news is that the Biden administration has switched that off and says, we'll be careful on China and we'll be careful on Taiwan. So if the Chinese have the assurance, why should they act?
Well, leading on from that question, we have one in the pigeonhole which asks...
Ask Stefan.
Yes, it's directed at both of you. How do you think countries can strike a balance between not to completely misunderstand China and have to completely play by China's rules? Some of you might take issue with the phrasing, but please share your views.
Actually, we cannot change China. We don't have to, we shouldn't believe that we can change it. We have to live with it. And the only way to compete with China is to stay strong yourself, to see that you have a booming economy, that you have a system that works, that you have a democratic system that is an example for the rest of the world, where people can see, I would like to live the way they are living as we had it during the last decades. But if the West is not concentrating on their own work, on what to do to develop, to get people studying, to have a free democracy, a free press, to have the possibility to travel, to let people inside the country, other people have to stay out. As long as we are not taking care of our own country, we cannot compete. And so it does not help if we look into other countries and say we don't want to be like them. We do not have to be like them. We don't have to want a communist system in Germany. But nevertheless, we need an economy that works, and we need to build our railway stations and airports and the whole infrastructure at least as good as they can do it. But if we see that a lot of things are made better there, we should rather concentrate on doing it better ourselves instead of giving other people advice to do it.
Well, I'm going to get Stefan into a lot of trouble. I agree with every word you said.
Okay, no, that's good. So we can move on to the last question. Who has the honors of taking the last one?
There, yeah.
Okay.
My name is Christian Echle. I'm the director of the Political Dialogue Asia of Konrad Adenauer Foundation, and I'm very glad that I'm still able to pose this question because, Professor Mahbubani, you basically said on a platform of the media program of Konrad Adenauer Foundation that censorship helps to keep the population happy, which is quite a statement for the media program of Konrad Adenauer Foundation. And I would argue against that. I don't believe that. I believe that censorship is maybe in order for a majority of the people, but if you think about the minorities, if you think about the Uyghurs, if you think about the Me Too activists, they suffer from censorship. That's the one side. The other side is that censorship also prevents a very important function of the media, which is to help accountability, to make sure that the government is accountable. So my question to you is, if you say the censorship is fine, where does accountability come from for the Chinese government, for Xi Jinping and his government? Because at least I believe that this is a very important mechanism in a country, that there's accountability for the government. Maybe you don't think that's true, but I'm really interested in your perspective on that.
You know, one thing I love about the English language is its precision. So when I said that censorship has not prevented the Chinese people from becoming happy, it doesn't mean that censorship has made the Chinese people happy. These are two very different statements, okay? It is true that there is censorship in China. It's also true that there's a lot of happiness in China. That's the reality that I am describing. Now, I would prefer, like you, to live in a society without censorship, certainly. But that's a choice you want, that's a choice I want. Let the Chinese people choose what they want. And when you ask for accountability, I suggest you look at 4,000 years of Chinese history. When the emperor fails, right? He loses the mandate of heaven, and in one way or another, the Chinese people have overthrown bad emperors for 4,000 years, right? They've suffered from time to time, which is true. And if you look at the cycles of Chinese civilization, all I'm saying is, you want to understand China, why don't you look at Chinese history, okay? Now, the Chinese go through cycles, right? When they have bad years, they have 200 bad years. Guess what? The Chinese have just had almost 200 bad years. Now the Chinese are beginning 200 good years, of which 40 years have just happened. And whether or not there's censorship or no censorship, another 160 good years are coming. That's the reality. I'm not saying I approve of it. I'm saying censorship is not going to make a difference, right? Because the Chinese have evolved their own social and political contract. You may not like it, I may not like it, but they seem to like it. And I want to emphasize a key point. It's a bit arrogant for Westerners to tell the Chinese people, we know better than you do what is good for you. And in this book, I cite an American ambassador, Chas Freeman. He says, we in the West don't understand that China suffers a ratio of people to arable land which is among the tightest in the world. If the United States had the same ratio of people to arable land as China does, United States wouldn't have 330 million people. United States would have 4 billion people. And Chas Freeman says, if we in America, if we had 4 billion people, we would accept far more controls and restrictions than we do today, because when you're crowded, living together, you accept a social contract which is much tighter and more disciplined than Americans will accept. So I'm not suggesting we should become like the Chinese. I agree with Stefan, right? We should look after ourselves. We should create our own societies. China is not asking us to transform ourselves. All that China is saying is, our society is good for ourselves. You keep your society and we'll live and work with each other. I think that's a perfectly reasonable statement.
Well, that the population agrees with censorship and dictatorship in countries that are not democracies, we know from our German history quite as well. And sometimes I think that the censorship of a government like that, which is not a democratic government, is not very successful either. You can see it with a little example when they stopped our two discussions presenting our book. It went through all the newspapers and it did not stop the book. Exactly the opposite happened. So I'm not sure that this control of the population in the end, on the long run, will be very good for the country, because when people are able to go to other countries, when they are able to read other newspapers, they want to have some kind of a discussion culture as well. And I think for a system, even if it's a one-party system, it's not bad when the discussions take part in the newspapers, in the magazines, on TV, except having only one view of the situation, which is the government view. I think for every country and the development of a country, even if it's not a democracy, it would be good to open it a little bit up. And we have the feeling now that under Xi Jinping, China is not opening anymore, but closing down. And I think this is not good for the world, and it's not good for China, but I'm not in a position to have a position what's good for China.
Right, and on that note, whether China is opening up or closing down, we clearly have very different views expressed today. But it's now time to declare that we've reached the end of the session. We've run out of time. So once again, Stefan, thank you for joining us, for your time.
Thank you.
Yeah,
and thank you.